everyone, and welcome to Indie Films. I'm Ken. Every independent filmmaker has a story to tell, not only through their films, but through the journey that led them to pick up a camera in the first place. Today we're getting to know someone many of you may recognize from LakeFront TV. He's one of our talented freelance videographers, but outside of our productions, he's built an impressive filmmaking career through his own company, Matt Wilcox Films. His newest documentary, Greetings from Florida, takes viewers on a fascinating journey through Florida's past from the early 1900s through the 1960s, using historic postcards to tell a story of the Sunshine State and how it became one of America's favorite destinations. Please welcome filmmaker Matt Wilcox. Matt, what an intro.
Glad to be here.
Thank you for joining us today. First and foremost, where I want to begin is, we talked about the intro of what led to picking up a camera. What led you to picking up a camera in the first place?
Sure. So I got into videography when I was in middle school. So it's been, well, I won't say how many years now, but it's been a few. And the reason is that I like stories and I love history. And of course, the word story is in history, so it seems like a good mesh. And telling history through the lens of a camera is so much more impactful than reading a book, but book reading as well too. So
I love that. And you mentioned storytelling in there and capturing things to tell stories through the lens of a camera. But a lot of folks sometimes in the industry goes and join major production companies to do that. But you instead went the entrepreneur route and started Matt Wilcox Films. What led you to do that and create your own brand and your own brand of telling stories?
Sure. It's a great question. When you look at the larger industry of filmmaking, there's usually certain stories that have to be pertinent to make a film. They have to be the great American epics that we have.
Ooh.
Well, when you go into Florida history, it's a lot harder to sell that, specifically because of the clientele that wants to watch it. I mean, the state of Florida may want to see it, but localities want to see it. People want to see their stories. They want to know what happened there. And that's really the juicy stuff. 90% of history happens at the local level. And then we talk about the other 10% all the time. So having that history that we can actually dive into, that I don't want to say it's forgotten, but it's kind of put aside. That's the kind of stuff that I love to dive into.
It's interesting that you mentioned it happens all at a local level, right? But Florida is unique in a sense because it's a tourist destination. And what you talk about, or you covered in your documentary, postcards from Florida specifically, where did that idea get born out of? Out of all the things in the Sunshine State, you wanted to focus on postcards?
Well, postcards, I've always been a guy that would go into an antique shop and look at things that I think 50, 100 years old and kind of curious where they came from. I did find a postcard from Leesburg in an antique shop years ago, and I thought, this is very interesting. And it tells a story because it has an image on the front and it has a story on the back. So when you think about it, a postcard is the social media of the turn of the 20th century. And it tells so much about the people at the time, what they spent their money on, where they went, what they saw, and what they wanted to have as an experience. So it was really kind of like, there's a story here. And there are many billions of stories with all the postcards that exist that we could really dive into and actually express the history of Florida through that, which is really kind of a unique way because it hasn't been dived down very often. We look at postcards, we think, yeah, it's a cool image. It's a nice pastel, very hyper-colored image that you would be attracted to. But when you think about the history behind that, the individual history, it's just fascinating. So yeah, it immediately got me onto that. There's a lot of things in Florida that also pertain to paper products, such as citrus labels, things like that. That was a huge way to advertise Florida and the citrus industry, especially at the turn of the century into the 1980s, 1970s, 80s, when we start to see a decline in the citrus industry. But the thing is that postcards have always been there, and they're still there.
Yeah.
You can go out and find a postcard and send it. It's a piece of it's a piece of you going in the mail.
It's interesting. When we think about the folks that will come out and watch and experience this, and you say some of it happens at the local level, and a lot of our audience focus on the other 10%, how do you use that lens to uniquely capture Florida and postcards all together? What tool are you using to captivate the audience with this specific story?
Sure. So, looking at a story as postcards directly on, that seems kind of, I won't say boring, but it's kind of, okay, there's so much a postcard can tell you. Well, what I've done is I wrote the script, I did the research, I talked to a lot of historians across the state, and I've interviewed them and put them in there as well. So we have kind of that Ken Burnsian style of, zoom in and zoom out on cards. But the thing about the cards is that they guide the story, the history. And in many cases, particularly in Leesburg and other smaller towns in Florida, there are things on postcards that just don't exist anymore. You can look at a main street and you'll find a house that I had no idea that was there. And that really is almost another world that you can dive into. So what's so fascinating for the kind of the hidden history is that you can talk about what you see there. You can get a true defined history based on scholarship, and you can understand that what you're looking at actually pertains to you and to the greater state of Florida.
What do you want your audience to walk away with then?
Well, I have 3 E's that I like to do when I go as a business model into any town. I have the education, entertainment, and of course helping out the economy. So what I'd like to do is have people come in there, be educated. You may have lived in a place your entire life and you may not know everything that happened there, and that's fine. We don't go into great detail in an hour and 40 minutes with every place in Florida. We just can't. But what I want an audience to get from this is they get to see something new that's entertaining, engaging, but really that they learn something that they can keep with them. It's really that moment they get to have.
Matt, thank you. Stay with us. When we come back, we'll dive deeper into Florida's fascinating history, discover why Leesburg plays an important role in a documentary, and hear about some of the amazing stories Matt uncovered while researching the Sunshine State. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indie Films. Today we're talking with filmmaker Matt Wilcox about his documentary, Greetings from Florida. The documentary covers Florida from the early 1900s to the 1960s. Matt, first of all, really fascinating stuff and why you got into this business and how you're taking it through the lens. But Florida has a very complicated history, going all the way, back to some of the stuff with St. Augustine and Ponce de Leon. But you focused on Florida from the 1900s to the 1960s. Why that certain time period?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, Ken, when we talk about 1900 to 1960, we are talking about the evolution of humanity in a spectrum, okay? Not only from the onset of what postcards are really coming on to what is called the golden age of postcards at the beginning of the 20th century. But when we look at what the modes of transportation were, most postcards show horseback, they show steam transportation. By 1960, we have rocket ships. We have people planning to go to the moon. And all of that's happening right here in Florida. So yeah, Florida has always been at the crossroads of what we would really call the New World. And of course, colonization from European powers at that. But really, 1900 and 1960 is such a transformational time because of all the things that happened. And in that time, you also have 2 global wars. You have the worst economic depression the United States has ever experienced. And you also have all these wonderful moments too, such as the roaring 20s. We have the housing boom in Florida. All of these things are happening. So it's a really exciting time.
Do you think that the increase in tourism played a part in it? Especially as we get into the 1960s, we start having things like, the Space Coast starting to boom. We have Gatorland and some of the theme parks at Walt Disney World in the 1970s. So do you think tourism played an important part in the growth of how postcards are distributed, the creation of postcards, and how it's being used to communicate during that time period.
Absolutely. And it's a vice versa kind of transaction, because postcards not only grew tourism in Florida, but tourism grew postcards. Really, when we look at the post-Civil War time period, right after 1865, America was trying to come back together. And there's so many wounds that were happening, but there's also so many exciting moments. The westward expansion that was happening, I hate to call it manifest destiny, but that was still in effect at that time. Florida was kind of like the last eastern frontier. We see that in books like A Land Remembered. But what we understand is that by the 1870s and the 1880s, you have big barons coming down here. Henry Flagler, Henry Plant. They're building railroads. They're connecting little outposts by rail, and then they're connecting them with large hotels. And that really brings tourism to what would birth the 20th century. And of course, the postcard kind of followed that. Now, had it not been there with the tourism that was introduced by business interests, and tourism leading that, then I don't think it would have existed. At the same time, had that technology been there to be able to produce colorful images that could really demonstrate that Florida was a hyper-real place. A lot of the technicolors and things are very pastel, they're very bright. You don't see a bad day in Florida on a postcard. And that tells you something. It tells you that if you're up north and it's 3 degrees outside, and you could go down to Florida and be on a beach, yeah, I want to do that. So tourism was a huge part, and that ebb and flow was right there.
Through your research, have you found that the folks who used postcards and highlighted postcards and even created postcards was segregated in any way? Was there any discovery that you saw that this area of Florida had a lot of postcards coming out, but their black population was a little lower, or conversely, on the other end, their black population was a little higher? And any rarity in finding some of those postcards designed by either black audiences or on the other side of the railroad by a white audience?
Right. Yes, it's a great question. And we have a section that is really, it's not labeled, but I call it the unequal time. Because postcards were used by everybody for everything, they really were the transit of communications other than telephone or telegram. So when we talk about the Jim Crow era of Florida, yes, there's many elements to that on postcards. We see that, not to give away too much, but you may see a surprise in the documentary when you see a postcard from Rosewood. Rosewood was destroyed in a racial riot, basically, in 1923, a week-long rampage, and it was a terrible time. That town still doesn't exist, but to know that there's a postcard in this film that actually came from that town and is stamped from the Rosewood post office is incredible. It really tells you that that happened. We talk about Ocoee. We talk about other darker...
And when you talk about Ocoee, is this specifically the Ocoee Massacre in 1920? Yes. Which is interesting that it happened, a Rosewood happened 3 years after. So there was a period there.
The sad part about it is, I mentioned earlier that we don't have, in the time that I had for the documentary, I was not able to cover all the situations that happened. So I really chose 3 major time periods or elements, events that happened. Rosewood, Ocoee. There was a killing of Claude Neal in Mariana. And there's a lot of histories behind all of these things that I want an audience to really understand, but you have to approach history with the empathy of what that time was and how terrible an injustice it was for anybody of different skin tone to be in Florida at that time. The interesting thing, back to your question, is that there's also a lot of immigration in Florida. It's fascinating. I mean, we call it really, Ybor was the Ellis Island of Florida. And you can see that you have Cuban, you have Spanish, you have German, you have Jewish, you have other elements that come down or are gathering in Ybor as kind of like this vestige of internationalism. But you also have groups down in like Boca Raton,
Mm.
Japanese Americans. So in 1905, you have the Yamato plant colony that comes in. And what's so fascinating about that is that you are looking at a racially made up group that's different than the white superior Jim Crow South. And yet they were accepted very well into the white community. They could go to white schools. They could enjoy that, as for African American residents could not. And you see that in the postcards. You see that in the imagery. Now, we'll talk about it too, but the Japanese colony would eventually be destroyed. That would be taken over by the U.S. government in 1942.
Hmm.
It's one of the examples of Eastern United States repression on Japanese Americans. But yeah, all of these cards, they tell a story that's so important. And you do see I don't know if I call it a segregation, but definitely a separation of imagery. And you see how African Americans are looked down upon
Mm.
on the imagery. And you can read that on the back because it's there. And there's one other group that's very important to understand about Florida. That's the original inhabitants, Native Americans, the Miccosukee, the Seminole. The same thing. That
Yep.
they are looked at as less than equal and as the other. And in the Seminole case, especially in the 30s and 40s, they really used postcards to show who they were as a tourism kind of revenue generator. So they didn't really mind the idea of having postcards that represented them that way,
Sure.
but it really benefited them because they had so little thanks to what we would call the Seminole Wars in the 19th century.
Yeah. What I always think is really interesting about filmmaking is the writer or director works together to give the audience a feeling that they may not have experienced in their living life, and at the end there is this lived experience that we all have together, and hopefully we'll never have to experience that. So through that unique storytelling of the historic lens, and then combine it with postcards, seems like it's going to be a really, really beautiful experience. And I think not just from the historical part, but in our minds, when we think of small towns, we always think of that quaint Main Street, right? It's almost like that that Main Street that never was, that will always will be. But you take time to also cover these Main Street areas. Why do you, we talked before this, and we talked about the length of the film, the total running time, but you take time to talk about those main streets. Why do you think that is such a critical part of the film, and how is that bridge used to connect with the audience?
Sure. So, one of the interesting things about the marketing, the advertising, postcards, or any other kind of marketing ability, especially in the second part of the 20th century, is that you really see, I don't want to get into Disney yet because that comes 1970s into Florida.
A little earlier in the 60s when he announced it, yep.
Looking for his land, but the attractions that we see in Orlando and thereabouts are really a later part of the 20th century phenomenon. So before then, what was Florida? A lot of it was on the coastline if you were a tourist, but a lot of it was interior. And that really is the separation between what Florida is between the coast and the inland. And really, if you look at Florida, it's kind of like 6 states put together. There's so many different
Interesting way to put
areas,
it.
right? Yeah, you have South Florida, that's its own culture. You have Central Florida, you have North Florida. You have Western Florida and the Panhandle. I call it LA, Lower Alabama. But it's really a unique combination of people, cultures, and entities. So when we look at the interior and you look at Main Street, it's a lot different than looking at Tampa on the coast, or Miami, or Jacksonville. And I mean, Orlando has that urbanization, of course, too, but not until later in the 20th century, about 1950s and onward. It doesn't really, it's a city, but it isn't the city that you would see Tampa or Miami being. And even Miami wasn't established really till the late 1890s. And, you think about Miami today and then think about what it was in 1900.
Yeah, very interesting.
Really, not what it is today. So it's cool.
And what about Leesburg? What place does Leesburg, what part does Leesburg play a part of this film?
Yeah, so Leesburg is just a fascinating town in itself, right? When you look at the postcards that are coming out of at the turn of the 20th century, 1905, 1906, that time period, early 1900s, you see a lot of the same postcards that you'd see all across the state. They would be of a palm tree. They would be of Lake Harris. They would be of maybe a road. You know, these are really kind of in today's mind. But why would you do that? Why would you make a postcard of that? Well, what Leesburg was this kind of paradise, a hopeful place to go to. And a lot of people came here. Annie Oakley came here. I mean, I don't want to call her a snowbird in that sense, but she was, right? And when you look at these postcards and understand Leesburg's placement, it really doesn't have a huge push until about the 1930s when it starts to really come up to being what we know Leesburg today to be. And then really World War II changes that. Leesburg becomes one of the many, we have about 170 bases across Florida during the war. And we train soldiers, sailors, airmen all across and from many nations here too. And what's fascinating about Leesburg is that we have German POWs that come here. We have the Army Air Corps field that is born here and that is worked here. It has a huge piece of World War II history, Florida history, and we have to look at that sense as saying that World War II was the pinnacle of change for Florida. It's what changes everything. And Leesburg is at the center of that.
Well, you mentioned Leesburg was hopeful. It was the center for what was the symbolism of hope that existed in Leesburg that folks would feel that?
So Leesburg is not in a vacuum. We have to look at Lake County as a whole. We have to look at the development of Lake County. I mean, it's 1887. There's 5 other counties in the state of Florida that are created that year, and actually in the first 6 months of that year.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting time for Florida's development. But when you look at Leesburg, you have to look at other towns, Tavares, Eustis, you have to look at Mount Dora, you have to look at Claremont, but that's a little bit later in time when it comes to being more developed as its own. This, what they would call the Golden Triangle of Lake County, and then of course Leesburg being attached to that. It is a hopeful place where people can come to, and that they can actually rest, relax, have a place that's a little bit, I want to go on that fairy tale, but a little bit away from the other parts of the country. And people love it. There's lakes here. The things that attract us to Leesburg today are what attracted people 100 years ago. So Leesburg is a really hopeful, happy place in that sense. And I want to go back to it. You have to remember Florida 100 years ago, 150 years ago is still a very segregated place. So it's not hopeful for everybody, and it's not a vacation place for everybody. Those who are seen as being in a place of vacation can come here. And I want to make sure that we also understand that in the time of Jim Crow, it wasn't just African Americans who couldn't necessarily enjoy the hope of Leesburg, but it was also poor whites. There was also others that just couldn't manage it. What we would call Hispanic or Latino at the time. They just couldn't come here to enjoy everything that you see in that. So yeah, there's a very idealistic moment for those cars.
That's a very important point to make, that Jim Crow laws transcended as time transcended, where it not only affected Black Americans but Asian Americans who were migrating, and states adapted some of their local laws to largen in what Jim Crow was, right? So I think that's very, very interesting. Through this, what surprised you the most about Florida history?
Yeah, the thing that's so surprising about Florida is just how polarized it has been. We've talked about racial segregation. We've talked about different backgrounds and the development that would come. We are one of the most unique places, I would say the most unique in this United States. And what you see people who would come down from up north who didn't have necessarily segregation as a legal form, and they'd question, especially in the 50s and the 60s, what is this? why is this happening? And then you'd also see people enjoying themselves on the beach. Those cards didn't have everybody that would be on that beach. But when we talk about that, there's such a bifurcation of what is Florida compared to our image outside of Florida and what is Florida on the interior. And that's one of the most unique things I've discovered in this project. And I continue to discover that because every town has its own is its own. It has its own history, it has its own culture. Yes, you can say that they are relative, but they're different, they're unique. So yeah, it's a very fascinating place to study.
We'll continue to talk about fascinating Florida. Still ahead, we'll talk about this premiere and how it's much more than a movie. Matt is creating an immersive experience that brings Florida history to life. That's what's coming up next. Welcome back to Indie Films. We've talked about the inspiration and history behind Greetings from Florida, a Matt Wilcox film. Now let's talk about the premiere experience. Most filmmakers simply release a movie. Matt is creating an event, and we want to talk about that event. It's interesting because The Odyssey just premiered in this month of July, and a lot of folks are going to that movie because the directing team, Christopher Nolan, directed it in a way that you have to go to a film. But you're taking that a step further, not just from the aesthetics of the film, but for folks participating in this community and watching a film together. Tell us about the premiere event and the experience you're creating around that.
Absolutely, Ken. So the film itself obviously is Florida history. It's talking about a time in our past. And in order to make that a little bit more fun for the viewer, for the visitor, we're having it in the historic Tropic Theater. The theater itself has history. It is history. So not only are you watching history, you're experiencing history. And on top of that, we're also having people come that would be dressed up as reenactors that can actually portray certain times in Leesburg history. And actually, you can have your picture taken with them. We have a step and repeat, one of those backdrops you can have your photo with. And of course, it has a postcard on it. And you can have all of this time that not only are you getting your money's worth, which for $15 a ticket is, I priced it that way so we can be more open to everyone. I want everybody to have that experience. I want them to have not only what the film would hopefully educate them with and give them that entertainment, but also I want them to have the experience of downtown Leesburg in a way that maybe they haven't had, or maybe in a way that they could have had 50 years ago with having popcorn and a drink, watching a movie in a historic theater. So yeah, it's a very romantic notion, and I think it's important for every small town in Florida to have that. Yeah.
And when are you premiering it and what times?
Absolutely. So it will be on September 12th, and it will be at 2 p.m. and 7 p.m. Now, because it's a historic theater, there's only so many seats. So it is important for people to get online and get those tickets, make sure that they get their seats reserved. It will be an hour and 39-minute film, so it's just long enough to learn all that you can from it, but not too long to get too sore in the chair. But again, going in, having that experience at the theater, enjoying all the history you learn from that, and actually being encompassed in history is just an experience beyond words.
Walt Disney, when he was creating theme parks, wanted to not only have audiences immersed in the attractions, almost like a movie feel, but also walk away singing the songs and the dialogue and whatnot. You're almost combining a similar experience outside the attraction standpoint. So what do you want your viewers and your audience to walk away with when they leave the Tropic Theater? Do you want them to say that in 1868, during whatever that was, singing a song, or I had a fantastic night with my family and friends? What do you want your audience to take away with?
All of the above.
Yeah.
I want them to have that experience where they get to learn something new and something that they might have grown up in a town or near a town that they had no idea that happened. And also that they get to come home thinking, you know what, that wasn't just something I went to go see. That's something that's going to stick with me for my life. And I hope that we can continue that down into the future too. I want this to be, it really is from a marketing perspective unique. Not a lot of people are doing this. And that's why I'm not afraid to share my business plan because you want
What is your business plan?
well, my business plan revolves around those three E's, education, entertainment, and economy. We want to make sure that we make films that are engaging but educational, documentary films. We want the experience to be grand, and we really want the economy to build up in each local town that we go to. Now, when I do things that are at a national level or at a state level, such as readings from Florida, we want to make sure that people are able to experience that in all parts of Florida. So really my business plan is to find those historic landmarks, those historic theaters that unfortunately more times than not have been either converted into something not used as a theater or forgotten about. Let's bring life back to it. And then bringing life back to that theater, let's bring life back to those towns that, although there may be, like in Leesburg, it's a great downtown. It's beautiful, it's well kept. But having that theater not just used for theatrical performances, but also used for movies, brings back a moment in time that we all get to treasure and have today.
If we were in this time period during the heyday of postcards, you and I would have completely different experiences. What do you think on your postcard in the state of Florida, in Central Florida, and Lake County? What do you think you would write on that postcard based on the research you have done, living in those moments through that immersive research? What do you think you would have written on that postcard?
It's funny, when I started this project up, I was in Pensacola for one of my interviews at the Lighthouse. Fascinating piece of history there too. And of course,
Sure.
Pensacola is very old. It goes back to the 1500s. So before I left, I found a postcard actually in the store, and I wrote it to my wife, and I was asking myself, what would I say on there? And I said, hi, sweetheart. The weather's this. It's about 80 degrees that day. Weather's nice. Very nice downtown. And I had a glimpse into that moment of what I would ask or what I would say on a postcard.
Oof.
It's just a moment. It's a text message that you'd send out today, except that it's on a piece of cardboard and I sent it through the mail.
Mm.
So that would be what we would say. And, that gives you a little insight to what people would have said 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And they did.
Yeah. What's next for Matt Wilcox Films?
So I have several productions in production. We are working on a second Seminole War film, which is really intense because of how long that conflict is. And we're also working on finishing post-production on a film about the Holocaust. Now, these films, the Second Seminole War is not so well known. It's known, don't get me wrong, but it's not in the visual format of a movie or a documentary as much as other conflicts or times in our history, American history. So that one will have a good following to it. Now, the Holocaust, there's a lot of films on that subject, and really, I follow one person who experiences that. And I was able to interview a very good friend of mine, Arnold Zweig, and he was a little boy when the Germans bombed his hometown of Danzig on September 1st, 1939. So not only do you learn about his experience as being a German Jew at that time, but being a young man who has to now grow up under this totalitarian regime that will take over Poland and most of Europe. And it's really about survival. It's really about understanding his perspective and seeing that right up until the end in April of 45 when the Americans liberated him. So it's a fascinating story. And all these stories are maybe already out there, but they're from a different perspective and they tell you something new, and it's really worth seeing.
This film isn't just going to premiere here in Leesburg. You mentioned the 3 E's of your plan, but an extension of that is taking it across the state of Florida in different historical theaters. Tell us a little bit about that decision and expand on that plan, if you will.
Sure. I mean, it's a little bit individual, I guess, personal on my end. Whenever I would drive, I like to go for little day drives and see Florida.
Beautiful.
Exactly. And there's so much in Florida that's so unique in so many places. You can get to really high hills and then go to a beach, in one day, in a few hours. And every time I go to these little towns, you see theaters, you'd see what was that element of having entertainment for people going back a century, right? So having a business plan that not only pertains to really my goal of making sure that people get an education of what they would have. It's not just a wasted 2 hours of time to be like, okay, this is information that I'm taking in. It's actually things that they can retain and use in their life, wherever that should be, the interest. But it's also a way to have entertainment that they can refill into those, maybe in some cases, empty theaters or underutilized theaters that have a history that is so ingrained into the culture of those towns, those cities. So my business plan is the three E's: education, entertainment, and of course, giving back that economy where we bring people into the downtowns. People come out from their towns, maybe some visit from out of town that want to see. And having that is really key to this success. It's key to us showing not only your town and your element of that film, of this film, but having you experience it and have a new sense of perspective on your town. And I'm doing that all across the state. So I am working with several theaters now. The plan is to go from Pensacola to Miami. If we can get to Key West, we'll do. And making sure everywhere in between gets to experience this film. Now, I guess as a businessman, I shouldn't be putting this in a sense, but I'm not out there to make my millions. I'm out there to really hit on the goals I have: education, entertainment, and making sure that the towns benefit. And if we can do that, that's a goal hit. That's what we want. And that's really my hope.
Before we wrap here, it's really fascinating if you listen to the entirety of our conversation and it's tied to postcards. Do you foresee a sequel where you talk about the digital era when we start going to postcards are no longer just things that you send, or the term snail mail comes out, right? And then you can then mail a postcard, but now you could do a digital postcard, right? With America Online or the age of the internet, and there's now other forms of that. Do you see yourself breaking into that chapter of the story to talk about how everyday Americans communicate in this digital era?
My background is in history. My master's is in that. And looking at the historical research that you'd have to do, we're in a very interesting time in the digital age. We have postcards because people didn't throw them away, and they're 100 years old. You know, they still exist. We can have them, they're primary documents. The problem with the digital age is that things are so fast that doing the projects in this age, we have many universities across the country that are trying to keep that information so it's not lost. But imagine how many text messages are sent in a day, just in the United States alone. And trying to keep track.
State of Florida alone.
Yeah, state of Florida, Pittsburgh alone.
Yeah.
Almost unfathomable.
Sure.
So it's very difficult to do something down that path. I think it would be fascinating to do that. I haven't contended it yet. If there is a way to make sure we have the sources that are necessary to do that, yeah, it would be something I'd entertain. But again, it's just a challenge in today's world to keep anything longer than a day.
Yeah, 30 seconds.
Yeah, 30 seconds. I mean, that's what digital has given us. It's given us speed, but it's also taken away a piece of us too. And that's not to be negative, but I can tell you what somebody did in 1937 in downtown Leesburg because I have a postcard of it. I can't tell you what somebody did yesterday because I don't have that text message.
Sure.
So.
Sure. Really, really interesting. If you're looking for a unique way to experience Florida's past, don't miss the Leesburg premiere of Greetings from Florida on Saturday, September 12th at the historic Tropic Theater in downtown Leesburg. There will be 2 opportunities to see the film, with showings at 2 p.m. and 7 p.m. Remember, this isn't just a movie, it's an experience. Guests are encouraged to dress in vintage attire, meet historical reenactors, take photos at life-size vintage postcard backdrops, and immerse themselves in the sight and stories that help shape the Sunshine State. Tickets are now available. For showtimes, ticket information, visit mattwilcoxfilms.com or follow Matt Wilcox Films on social media. On behalf of everyone here at LakeFront TV, thanks for joining us for this edition of Indie Films. Until next time, we'll see you at the movies.